as we've already established, there was actual systemic racism against the black community for a long time. It's a terrible, evil thing. Everybody agrees on that point. I don't think anyone disagrees. That is over now. There is no longer a system in place that is designed to deprive black Americans of rights. I mean, would you agree with that at least?
No, I do think it's still designed that way, but it's designed in a way where it can't be litigated because it's not in the law.
Okay, but so can you point to me an exact point of the system, an exact place in the system, a policy that is designed to deprive black Americans of rights?
The same people that designed the system to protect the wealth of the upper class, in the throughout American history, continued to be in control.
Yeah, but now you're talking about class, not race. I'm talking about race.
Right, but how do you disrupt class if you're so segregated by, how do you disrupt race if you're so segregated by class?
In this video, we're diving into a heated debate between Matt Walsh and Ryan Grimm, host of Breaking Points, over the controversial topic of systemic racism today. This debate was sparked by Matt Walsh's latest film, Am I Racist?, which tackles tough questions surrounding race and the ongoing narrative of racism in America. Both sides came prepared, with Matt standing firm on his stance that systemic racism is no longer a major issue, while Ryan Grimm argues the opposite, leading to a compelling exchange of ideas. Matt Walsh made some excellent points during this debate, and it's clear that Ryan Grimm was chasing his own tail with hypotheticals. Matt was right to push back on the idea of systemic racism in today's world, especially when there's no solid evidence to support it anymore. Ryan was trying to make the case that systemic racism is still prevalent, but Matt systematically dismantled his arguments by sticking to facts and logic, rather than getting caught up in baseless theories. It's an interesting conversation with plenty of back and forth, so let's go ahead and take a look at how both sides present their arguments. Make sure to pay attention to the key moments where Matt Walsh holds his ground and doesn't back down. You won't want to miss this. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video to help spread the word and keep these important discussions going. Let's dive in.
You said earlier that we have less racism here than lots of other countries, which I think is a fair point to make.
Glass half full.
And obviously you would acknowledge that at some point in our history, we had lots of racism, right?
Sure.
Lots of racism then, less racism now. Mm-hmm. So when did we get to a point where it wasn't systemic and it was no longer a problem that we as a democratic society need to deal with? What was the moment in your mind?
Well, I'm not sure that you could point to one exact moment in time when it goes from a systemic issue to not systemic anymore. But what we know for sure is that right now we are certainly in the moment where it's not systemic. Any time in history, I'll answer your question. Yeah. At any point in history, when you can go back and look at actual laws and policies that were in place that deprived Black Americans or any other group of rights, well, that was a time when you had systemic, and we know that existed historically. Yeah. So if you wanted to point to an exact moment, I guess the most obvious moment would be the Civil Rights Act. But of course, these are changes that happen gradually over time, just like with slavery. You can't, even with slavery, you can't really. People like to point to the Emancipation Proclamation as the moment when slavery was ended. Of course, we know that wasn't when it ended. So we know we don't have slavery anymore. But if you were to ask me, what's the exact moment when slavery stopped? Well, it wasn't an exact moment. It was a gradual ending of that horrific institution. But certainly now it doesn't exist anymore, in this country anyway. And I'd say the same thing with systemic racism as well, that nobody is creating policies, again, that are deliberately intended to create disadvantages for quote-unquote people of color.
I have a question about that. A lot of conservatives will say there is one policy, and this is, you're about as anti-abortion and pro-life as it gets. A lot of conservatives will say a remaining institution of systemic racism is abortion. because it disproportionately, as conservatives make this argument, affects Black children and Black families. Is that an example of systemic racism or racism, period?
And I think it's a mistake when conservatives make that point, because I think conservatives are very desperate to be able to do the whole thing where they turn back on Democrats and say the Dems are the real racists.
Yes.
And I just think that's a lame move, and you're trying to use the left's own language against it, which I think it doesn't work because you're accepting sort of their premise. So what I'd say about abortion is, no, it's not systemically racist. It does disproportionately impact the Black community, no question about it. But does it exist for that? Really, is Planned Parenthood, is that why they exist right now? Because they want to kill Black babies? No, Planned Parenthood exists because they want to kill babies, and they don't care what color the baby is. They just want the money that comes from it. But it just so happens that ends up disproportionately impacting the Black community. And this goes to the disproportionate impact thing, which I'm glad you brought that up, because that's usually what's used to support the theory of systemic racism, is they say, well, but these policies disproportionately impact certain groups. Okay, they might, but that doesn't mean that they're intended to do that. Just a disproportionate number of Black Americans end up in prison. Does that mean that that's why the prison is there, to put Black Americans in it? No. The reason why a disproportionate number of Black Americans end up in prison is that, unfortunately, a disproportionate number of Black Americans commit violent crime. That's just what the stats show. And
right. So there's an argument that a system is what it does, and that claiming otherwise is just kind of hocus pocus, just magic. Like if a system produces a certain result, but you as an observer of that system say, well, actually, that's not what the system is supposed to do. Those words are just meaningless.
What about
and
a system?
The system just chews them up and spits them out and produces and continues to produce the result that it produces. Like, for instance, during Jim Crow, pre-Civil Rights Act, you've got laws on the books that are systemically racist, that allow for straight up racist results. When it comes
design
to
of the system was explicitly racist.
Design of the system is aimed at producing segregated schools and low-income households. Low-income neighborhoods that are predominantly or almost exclusively populated by Black Americans, right? Mm-hmm. You then pass laws that reform those laws, that make it so that you can't legally do those things anymore. Yet the power structure broadly remains in place, and the results stay the same. You still have, broadly speaking, massive low-income areas, predominantly populated by Black families, and you continue to have segregated schools. And so a person who was born into this country today, if they're Black, they're more likely to grow up in one of those neighborhoods. They're more likely to go to terrible schools rather than good schools. They're more likely to end up in prison or in part of the system. And so you would step back and say, well, the system is still doing what it is. The system never stopped doing it. There was never a day from Monday to Tuesday to Wednesday that all of a sudden the system stopped working in the same racist way, which we acknowledge was racist when it was written into the law.
Although the system
but
produces...
now we pretend it's not because we struck through that one line.
Yeah, but if we agree that you say the system is what it does, I'd probably disagree with you on that. What the system is intended to do is what it certainly matters here.
But why?
But also,
why would it matter? What we intend a system to do?
Because that's what we're talking about.
The system produces a robust Nigerian middle class, like people who come here from Nigeria. Thomas Sowell makes this point. It's a point that's popular.
So then that's a defense of the system.
That's what I'm saying.
Because that's what it does.
Right, that's what I'm saying. So does that go both ways?
No, because the intent of this, my point is that the intent, whatever you intend a system to do is meaningless. Like if you intend for a house to have a roof and a second floor that is sturdy, but when you walk into the second floor, you fall through it.
But that doesn't reflect
on you.
But that doesn't reflect on your anti-roof sentiments.
Yeah, and also
it doesn't matter.
And also, but to use your analogy, if you walk into a house and there's a problem in the house, you can't automatically assume that it's the fault of whoever built the house. It could be, depending on the problem. But you also have to look at who's living in the house, who's supposed to be maintaining the house. And if you're living in a house and you're not taking care of it, and in fact you're mistreating the house and it goes to hell, and then you turn around and blame whoever built the house 100 years ago, well, I'm going to say, like, well, this is at some point you got to take responsibility for your own house. And so that's my point with the black community as it stands right now in America. Yes, as we've already established, there was actual systemic racism against the black community for a long time. It's a terrible, evil thing. Everybody agrees on that point. I don't think anyone disagrees. That is over now. There is no longer a system in place that is designed to deprive black Americans of rights. I mean, would you agree with that at least?
No, I do think it's still designed that way, but it's designed in a way where it can't be litigated because it's not in the law.
Okay, but so can you point to me an exact point of the system, an exact place in the system, a policy that is designed to deprive black Americans of rights?
The same people that designed the system to protect the wealth of the upper class, in the 40, throughout American history, like continued to be in control.
Yeah, but now you're talking about class, not race. I'm talking about race.
Right, but how do you disrupt class if you're so segregated by? I mean, how do you disrupt race if you're so segregated by class?
Well, but I don't think you can bring class into this because I would agree that we could talk about class. I'll agree that there are elites who care about themselves and don't care about the lower class. I would say that those people are just as unconcerned with a white person in a trailer park in Appalachia as they are unconcerned with a black person in the inner city. So it is class. We can talk about that. But my question was, because we talk about the system, it's a broad concept here. So let's narrow it down. Let's find a piece of the system that we can point to and say, well, this is designed to hurt black people.
Okay, so if you go to Georgia, for instance, after they implemented school desegregation, what they started doing is saying, oh, okay, well, we can't legally keep black people out of our neighborhoods or out of our schools, but what we can do is we can secede from our neighborhoods. You've been to the Atlanta suburbs?
A little bit.
Like every four,
Unfortunately.
like every four,
Try to stay away.
Yeah.
like every 4 blocks for a long time, you had like new school districts, and they would be drawn. They would be just basically gerrymandered. Like they would know where the white people were, and they would gerrymander the school district so that only white people would be at part of this.
Yeah, but you're going back to desegregation.
No. This is what they're doing now. Like this is up to today. Like, so what they're doing is they're saying, okay, these are the new laws in place. However, we like our system of segregation and racism that we have here. So how do we hire the best lawyers
Is that about class? Or
to show that, but it's also about race?
Well, but I'm saying, do you think primarily in the minds of the designers of the system, are they actually discriminating intentionally on a class basis, or is it
pretty race driven?
I don't think that there's any evidence that it's race driven. I think in like an example you give, it's class, it's people wanting to avoid crime-ridden, impoverished areas. Maybe someone doesn't want to send their kids to school in a place that's high crime, and there's going to be a lot of delinquency and everything in the school system. I don't think it's because the kids are black. It's just because of that. And also, the other thing is when we talk about,
but at what point?
When we talk about school districts or the way communities are set up, here's another point that rarely comes up. It's pretty simple. You can move, right? So you can always move. I mean, if you live in a community where you're claiming it's been set up systemically to disadvantage it, I don't buy that. But if I did, I would say, well, you should probably move from that community. I mean, you can go somewhere else. There's no law saying you can't. And if there was a law saying...
Some HOA situations will try to block.
Yeah, but they're not going to say you can't move here if you're black.
It's also why a lot of black community groups support voucher systems to allow, work with conservatives on voucher systems to allow kids to get to different schools.
So when you see stats that say like a black homeowner who's trying to get a mortgage, who has a higher credit score and higher income, gets a higher interest rate from the average bank than a white applicant, A bunch of these studies have been done where they'll put in like a black sounding name and higher credit scores, higher income, better candidates on paper other than their name. And they get overall, there have been so many studies that have replicated this. They get a higher interest rate, which means their cost of borrowing is higher, means the mortgage is higher, which means you have to have that much more money to move into the neighborhood that you're talking about. So systemically, it doesn't say, well, if you're black, you can't live here. But systemically, what it does is it makes it easier for white people to move into these wealthier neighborhoods, harder for black people to move into those neighborhoods.
Ryan Grimm seems to be listening to progressive commentators too much. What he just said about systemic racism in mortgage lending is simply not true, and it's completely against the law. Mortgage officials, realtors, which, by the way, don't even deal with interest rates, and anyone involved in discriminatory lending practices would lose their licenses for life if they were caught doing anything like that. So to claim that this is still some kind of systemic issue is absurd. Let's be real here. The idea that banks care more about someone's skin color than the color of their money is just flat out wrong. Banks are profit-driven institutions. They care about one thing more than anything else: making money. They don't care if you're black, white, or purple, as long as you're able to pay back the loan with interest. This is capitalism 101. If anything, banks are incentivized to approve loans and generate revenue, not deny them based on race. And as for the studies Grimm mentioned, let's not forget the devil is in the details. If you're going to make claims like that, you better have the data to back it up, and even then, it's not so simple. Interest rates fluctuate daily. Did those studies account for the specific day the information was entered? What about the buyer's credit score, down payment, or whether it was a buyer's market? There are countless factors at play that can influence the rate a borrower receives, none of which have anything to do with race. Moreover, there have been cases where banks are required to open branches in lower income or minority-heavy zip codes to ensure equal access to financial services. If anything, that shows the system working in the exact opposite way that Grimm is claiming. If banks were truly racist, why would they be forced to operate in areas where loan applications are fewer and potentially less profitable? It completely contradicts his argument. At the end of the day, the system is focused on profit, not race. The narrative that banks are secretly scheming to keep black families down is a distraction from the real issues facing the economy and financial industry. If we really want to tackle disparities, we should focus on financial literacy and economic empowerment, not baseless claims of systemic racism.
And that's before you even get to the wealth effect. Jim Crow, only ended recently, which means that if you look at the kind of savings rates and the inheritance rates for the average black family, it's close to nil, especially after the subprime mortgage wipeout of 2008, compared to white families, which can go to mom and dad and grandma and grandpa and say, can you help put my kids in private school? Can you pay the down payment? 20% is an awful lot for this mortgage.
Generational wealth.
Yeah.
Right.
So you combine the fact that they have to pay higher interest rates with the fact that there's lack of generational wealth. That to me is systemic. But I'm curious specifically on the interest rate question. What's going on there? And should that be a problem that we as a democratic society should address? Like, why are black loan applicants paying higher mortgage interest rates across the board? And again, that is replicated across the economy.
Okay, I'd have to look at the studies you're talking about. You say that they've been replicated time and time again. There's no issues with the studies, and there's no issues methodology.
I'm sure people could pick some of the studies apart, but it's pretty well accepted.
Yeah, I'd have to know who is accepted by exactly. But so for the sake of argument, let's say that those studies are totally legit. I would still go back to a class issue on that. And the reason is that, look, banks...
But the white...
Well, can we explain? Okay. Like, banks care about the money. That's all they care about. They don't care about... these banks are not being run by people who are saying, we got to keep black people poor. They don't care about that. I don't think they care about anybody. They care about the money. And so if that's happening, they're making stereotypical assumptions, class-based assumptions that I believe they would probably also make if somehow they got they had the impression that this was, say, a white, quote unquote, white trash, as they're often called, from the trailer park. You know, if I think the banks would have the same sort of skeptical, discriminatory attitude in that case as they would to someone who they're assuming is from the inner city, let's say.
Right, but so the other word for that would be implicit bias. So let's say the banks.
We have to wrap, by the way. We have a hard no.
Oh, but let's say we got to wrap in a second. But let's say the banks only do care about money. That's a reasonable thing to say. So then, what could explain why they would treat the two differently? It would have to be like you're saying. But what you're saying is there might be some implicit bias toward if they could identify some poor white guy, which goes to the point though of how it's easier for poor whites, which I was used to be one of, but it was easier for me to migrate out. My name is Ryan Graham.
I don't even think
you can't even tell that I was white trash.
Right.
I mean, you can if you know me pretty well, but but you can't tell on a resume or an application.
You see his
to a
arrest
bank.
record.
Yes.
I don't know. You're wearing a tie and everything. I wouldn't say. I mean,
There you go.
It could have fooled me.
Yeah.
Look, but I wouldn't even call it implicit bias. I think it's just like banks. They are biased against people they don't think will pay their mortgage, basically.
Right. And so why don't they think a person with a black name will pay their mortgage?
Because I think in that case,
despite a high credit score and a high income.
if that is true, then they're making assumptions they're making class-based assumptions. This is a lower income person coming from a low income neighborhood, even if their current income is, the same as, that's the background. And so
sounds like those people face a systemic
We gotta
problem.
go.
Well, class-based, but that's what I'm talking about.
Yeah, we're getting told.
We're getting in the ear. Matt, thank you so much. This is a fascinating conversation. I really enjoyed the movie. Ryan, what'd you think?
It's funny. I'll acknowledge this. The movie's funny. These guys are
You
clowns.
put that on the poster.
Yeah. These guys are total clowns.
Matt Walsh, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Considering this is a podcast, it's strange that the producers cut them off. The only reason I can think of is that Ryan Grimm was spiraling down a rabbit hole that made no sense. Matt Walsh was completely right in everything he said, and Ryan was just chasing his tail, repeating points that don't hold up. The producers probably thought, let's wrap this up before it gets even more off track. It's unfortunate that Matt Walsh even entertained Ryan's hypothetical situations. Walsh himself said earlier in the debate that he doesn't like indulging in these what-if scenarios because they end up lending credibility to Democratic talking points. But I understand, Walsh was a guest, and they were throwing these questions at him, probably hoping to catch him in a gotcha moment. These podcasts love setting up traps like, oh, Matt Walsh said this. They were trying to get something they could twist later. Despite that, I think Walsh handled himself really well, staying composed and sharp. I never expected I'd be defending banks in this conversation. Don't get me wrong, I'm not here to sing their praises, but Ryan's argument forced me to point out how far off he was. Banks aren't perfect, but claiming they're acting systemically racist without real proof is just grasping at straws. I hope you all enjoyed this video. If you did, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel.